Bill Mauldin spent about 2 months in Sicily. One day, making his way back to Victoria, he was strafed by Stuka dive bombers, but he and his crew were able to produce 3,000 copies of the 45th Division News. A practical solution to getting the text looking right was to use upside-down M's for W's. And to overcome a shortage of paper, Bill used the reverse side of portraits of Mussolini and King Victor Emmanuel III on which to draw his cartoons. He managed to source zinc in a coffin maker's shop. He had to buy the coffin and then rip out the metal lining, and he procured nitric acid in a black market warehouse. In Palermo they had the luxury of electricity as well as modern printing press and a fully equipped engraver. Combatant correspondents were urging their bosses to use Bill's cartoons. His work reminded them of Bruce Bairnsfather, the British soldier cartoonist, whose World War I cartoons captured the grim humour of life in the trenches. General George Patton, commander of the US 7th Army, was not a fan of Bill's cartoons. General Troy Middleton, Bill's commander, made sure he wasn't around headquarters when Patton was about. Middleton believed Bill's cartoons were worth more in morale than all the overseas entertainment combined. He said, "Better to have the men work off their complaints vicariously through a Mauldin cartoon than to have them store up their grievances." Patton wanted to get rid of Bill. Middleton asked him to put that in writing, but Patton's infamous slapping incident distracted the general from his resolve. Military censors didn't allow corpses to be featured in reports, so Bill substituted damaged buildings to portray the destructive nature of war. He said, "Bomb-blasted houses are constant reminders of war long after the dead are buried." Bill got sand flea fever and had to be hospitalized. On his release, he and 20 others were assigned to a replacement depot, which meant that they could be used wherever they were needed. They were having none of this. They managed to escape from this detail and make their way back to their own units in time for the Salerno landings. Bill and his crew successfully produced 2 editions of the 45th Division News before moving on to Naples. That city's infrastructure was in ruins, and though Bill and his crew found accommodation near a print shop, it took him a month to locate an engraver. He spent 4 to 5 days on the front line, the German winter line, at Venafro, and then returned to Naples to publish the images he had created. Bill won a Purple Heart while observing the German lines near Venafro. He was injured by mortar fire. He had just started the column up front with Mauldin in Stars and Stripes. Now he was drawing for a bigger audience, the US 5th Army in Italy. He was sought out for interviews by Time Life magazine and by Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who would win the Pulitzer Prize in 1944. Pyle described Bill's cartoons as funny, terribly grim and real. The central character, he said, looks more like a hobo than like your son. Pyle's reviews impressed Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of the president, and she also clamoured for Mauldin's cartoons to be used more widely. Mud cartoons were the essential truth of the Italian campaign. In Italy, 70% of all non-combat injuries came from trench foot, a medical condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to damp and cold. Of the 16 million Americans that served in World War II, only 5% actually saw extended combat. The infantry made up only 14% of those sent overseas, but they suffered 70% of the casualties. It was no wonder that the infantry was often considered to be the neglected stepchild. The US High Command in Naples was not happy with the attention that Stars and Stripes gave to disgruntled combat soldiers. The newspaper published sharp critiques of the war's poor logistics. For example, by spring of 1944, pilfered Allied supplies amounted to 65% of the per capita income of Naples. Bill considered the garrison MPs as bullies. They overlooked the blatant pilfering down at the docks, but kept a vigilant watch on the restricted zones in and around Naples. Bars and clubs were strictly off limits, and even the smallest infringement was punished. On the 22nd of January 1944, the Allies landed at Anzio, just south of Rome. There they would be stuck for 4 months. The Anzio beachhead became a cartoonist goldmine for ideas. Allied headquarters lay in a clear line of sight for German guns. The latrines were regularly hit. Mauldin observed that when you deprive field-grade brass hats of their leisurely morning bowel movement, you have created a serious morale problem. In February 1944, Mauldin left the 45th Division News for Stars and Stripes. There was a very relaxed style and atmosphere at this newspaper. No one ever saluted, and everyone was on first-name terms. The characters Willie and Joe made their debut in Stars and Stripes on the 29th of February 1944. Though the tide of war was turning for the Allies, the US administration didn't want complacency to set in. They needed images depicting the tragic aspect of battle, and Mauldin's renown as a combat cartoonist coincided with this policy. Field censors put a halt to Bill's cartoons on 3 occasions, mostly because the background sketches showed new and undisclosed equipment. In February 1944, Bill crashed his motorbike, a very patched-up Harley-Davidson, on one of his journeys back and forth to the front. General Mark Clark gave him a new Jeep instead. The breakout from the Anzio beachhead began on the 23rd of May 1944. The race to Rome was underway, with Mark Clark believing that the British wanted to thwart his attempt to seize the prize of liberating the Eternal City. Clark won the race, but the D-Day landings that began 12 hours later completely overshadowed the importance of the Italian campaign. Bill and his colleague Fred Sheehan were among the first into Rome. An advance guard of Stars and Stripes had set up their stall in the offices of the Italian newspaper Il Messaggero. Bill told a story of being thrown out of a hotel that was reserved for officers and the Red Cross. He and Fred had been given the best room in the hotel 2 days beforehand. They had arrived wearing no insignia of any kind, and the manager presumed they were officers. When he later discovered his mistake, he asked them to leave. Anyway, Bill preferred to bivouac with the troops, and he wanted no part of the clubby atmosphere of the hotel where he would have to socialise with officers. But the real war was in Normandy, and Bill needed to be there. Operation Dragoon was the code name for the Allied landing in southern France near Caen on the 15th of August 1944. Bill wanted to witness the liberation of a French city, so he raced north to Grenoble. While there, he produced his own Wildcat issue of Stars and Stripes, the first printed edition in southern France. He also founded a Carthusian monastery where wine was made from alpine herbs, a process known only to 3 of the monks there. Bill liberated 2 bottles of the famous chartreuse. He was back in Rome in October 1944 to finish off some drawings for his forthcoming book. But by January 1945 he was in Paris. There he was arrested for not looking like a soldier. He wasn't wearing a complete uniform. He even wore a Russian-style hat and supported no insignia of any kind. Instead of jail, he was delivered to the offices of Stars and Stripes. General de Gaulle, the French military leader, complained about how French truck drivers were portrayed in one particular cartoon. When General Patton complained once more, Bill was called in by General Oscar Solbert from the Information and Educational Division. He was a big fan of Bill's cartoons. It was alleged that Bill's characters were affecting replacement troops, who think they've got to roll in the muddy ditch and grow whiskers before they're socially acceptable. Captain Harry Butcher, an aide to Eisenhower, arranged a meeting between Bill and Patton in Luxembourg on the 27th of February 1945. Bill got a tongue-lashing from Patton. Questioned on specific cartoons, Bill said they allowed the soldier to let off steam. He explained that when aggrieved soldiers open Stars and Stripes and see a cartoon that expresses their gripes, they feel validated and are thus less likely to cause problems within the ranks. Later, Time magazine published an account of the meeting, calling it G.I. Mauldin versus G. Patton. Eisenhower subsequently ordered officers not to interfere in such things as Mauldin's cartoons. Bill was back in Italy in mid-March of 1945 to launch his book called Up Front. He was present at the front lines in the Po Valley for the Allied advance on Milan, and at one stage Bill was given a German shepherd dog by a German prisoner who didn't want the dog let loose. Bill was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for distinguished service as a cartoonist. It was announced on the day after the war ended. Allied command responded with a Legion of Merit award for him, but Bill harboured bitterness towards the wicked war that had catapulted him to fame. There was something of a survivor's guilt about it all. He felt his cartoons had reduced men at the front to a sort of patriotic commodity. When General Lucien Truscott gave the Memorial Day speech at Anzio, he turned his back on his audience and addressed those in the graves before him. Bill thought this the most moving gesture I ever saw. In June 1945, Bill flew home from Casablanca on a C-54 transporter. He was given the temporary rank of Major General in order to get high priority clearance. In other words, he was an official army VIP. He had started the war as an obscure technical sergeant, grateful to have escaped the infantry, and he returned home as the most famous enlisted man in the US Army. His discharge took place at Fort Dix. His new book, Up Front, spent 19 weeks at the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and the film rights were sold for $50,000 and 10% gross. After the war, Mauldin became quite politicised. He spoke out against anti-communism, the Red Scare that, in his view, threatened progressive social reform and the very civil liberties men had fought and died for during the war. By November 1945, Willie and Joe had become gas station attendants and slipped out of his cartoons. Their last cartoon had Willie voicing dismay that Nazi Germany was now considered more preferable than the Soviet Union. He is standing on a darkened street, feeling betrayed, saying, "According to you, mister, I spent the last 3 years helping my worst enemy kill my best friends." In later years, he had a part in the film The Red Badge of Courage in 1951, playing a character called The Loud Soldier, with Audie Murphy in the lead role. During the Korean War from 1950 to 53, he worked for the Reader's Digest. During the 1952 American presidential election, he served as an aide to Adlai Stevenson, the unsuccessful Democratic contender. He covered the 1953 coronation of Queen Elizabeth II from a remote Cornish village and then wrote his way across Europe. He won a second Pulitzer Prize in 1959 for a cartoon that showed Soviet writer Boris Pasternak in a gulag asking another prisoner, "I won the Nobel Prize for Literature. What was your crime?" His son Bruce was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and he visited him at Pleiku in the Central Highlands, where he got caught up in a Viet Cong attack on the base. In 1967, he covered the Arab-Israeli war in the Middle East.